Grief and outrage in Texas after a white police officer fatally shot an African-American woman inside her own home.
On police body cam video, an officer is seen approaching a door of Jefferson's home in Fort Worth. The screen door is closed, the solid door is open, and the lights are on inside. The officer walks the perimeter of the house. Then, as he approaches a window,
"Put your hands up! Show me your hands!"
The officer had fired within only a couple of seconds after shouting his verbal command, and never did he identify himself as police. Tatiana Jefferson, 28 years old, died on the spot in her bedroom early Saturday morning.
This has happened again, and I think a big factor for a lot of people that I'm seeing online is that this woman was just inside her home playing video games with her nephew.
It makes you not want to reach out and call law enforcement if you think something like this is going to happen.
It has to be admitted right off the top that the left-wing critique of Black Lives Matter is bullshit. Yes, I said it. Of course, the right-wing critique of BLM is bullshit. That's no surprise to anyone. Basically, what the right wing says is that it's some conspiracy set up by George Soros, etc. But the left-wing critique also is bullshit. For the most part, what you find on the far left is a group of people complaining that Black Lives Matter is not Marxist enough, not socialist enough, not anti-capitalist enough, that it's implicitly or secretly a pro-capitalist movement. Yes, yes, once again, the left wing claims it's secretly orchestrated by George Soros, just trying to get mainstream corporate Democrats reelected. You know who that means in the year 2020. That's all this is. There is a left-wing critique of BLM that is just as awful as the right-wing critique. But between the two, you'll notice one interesting difference. The right wing complains that Black Lives Matter is implicitly or secretly Marxist, whereas the left wing is complaining that the problem is they're not Marxist enough or not Marxist at all. So I took some time and did some research into what are the intellectual sources of the Black Lives Matter movement, and there are some positive surprises. There is good news and bad. But I'm happy to say I actually do have some good news in this video and one good book to recommend, both for the history and the future of Black Lives Matter. In this video, we're dealing with two books attached to four very different political personalities and myriad possibilities for the future of Black Lives Matter as a movement, each of them linked in a dynamic way to the reevaluation of African Americans' radicalism in the past. So book one here is called Revolution in the Air, and this has a foreword by Alicia Garza. If you don't know who Alicia Garza is, she is the co-founder of Black Lives Matter. She has her own podcast, she has her own Twitter. She is as much the leader and face of, voice of Black Lives Matter as anyone else can be. She's one of the first names you're going to find if you're Googling around trying to figure out who is Black Lives Matter, who defines what this movement was, is, and ought to be. Now this book, Revolution in the Air, is a reevaluation of and a revalorization of Black communism. So it's looking back to communists and Marxists in the United States of America, primarily in the 1960s and 1970s, and then naturally it's drawing conclusions about their failure, because that movement was a failure, and looking forward to the future. And what's very interesting to note is that Alicia Garza, in the introduction, has the honesty to really reflect that when she first discovered this book, she was a young aspiring radical, a young aspiring revolutionary, political organizer. She did not find in the pages of this book at all the answers that she was looking for. And now a new generation of young black revolutionaries, intellectuals, etc. are going to be discovering this book, partly because Alicia Garza's name is on the cover and she wrote the introduction, and they also are not going to find the answers that they're looking for. The very fundamental question that this book sort of asks and then refuses to answer. We'll see in just a moment what Alicia says. I appreciate her honesty in the introduction, but she can only be honest up to a point. The fundamental question is, wasn't it a tragic, awful mistake for these African Americans, who are only a tiny, tiny minority of black people in the United States of America? Wasn't it a tragic and awful mistake for them to try to attach their dreams of a better future to Stalin, Mao Zedong, Lenin, and even Karl Marx? Wouldn't they have been better off drawing inspiration from any other source imaginable? Now, the second book I'm going to mention here, which, again, even a quick Google search, you're very likely to find this named as the main, intellectual touchstone for, or locus classicus for what's going on in Black Lives Matter today, is a book titled Black Marxism. The single greatest surprise about this book is that, of course, people buy it, they look at the cover, they assume that because the title is Black Marxism, the implicit thesis of this is going to be that black people ought to be Marxists, or that it's going to be an African-American approach to Marxism that's fundamentally pro-Marx. And it's not. This book is a brilliant and highly erudite demolition of Marxism. It completely destroys the intellectual legacy of Karl Marx, and it does so in an elegant and fascinating way. It's a great read. I've only read the first 2 chapters. I'll probably read the rest of it in the next few weeks. But let me tell you something. The chapter 1 alone really could be a standalone book. The style of Cedric Robinson is such that it absolutely presumes you are the type of highly erudite reader who recognizes the name Henri Pirenne, that you're someone who has already read Henri Pirenne, that you're already at a very, very high level of sophistication and education to appreciate this. He assumes you're someone who's already well-versed in and even a little bit bored with the academic fad of world systems theory. It so rapidly goes through the whole history of, I was going to say the Western world, but it's most of the world, frankly, in the first chapter, that in an era before the invention of Wikipedia, it's very difficult to imagine a teenager or even someone in their 20s being able to sit down and appreciate this book, because there are so many things you'd have to Google, you'd have to look up on Wikipedia, you'd even have to find a map for that are dealt with rapidly. And again, this book, much like Black Lives Matter itself, it ended up not having any audience to appreciate it during the author's lifetime. The author just recently died, I believe in 2016. But during the author's lifetime, he alienated himself because people who really know Marxism, they figure out soon enough that this book is actually profoundly hostile to Marx. Even though it states its conclusions in these kind of elegant and erudite ways, he'll say things like, in the 19th century, all of these facts were misinterpreted as heroic narratives of the so-called working class were constructed. He says this sort of thing. He doesn't directly say Karl Marx and his work is garbage. But if you know Marx already, if you understand Marx and Marxism, if you're at a high level of education in that area, these are really zingers. This is, this really has a lot of verve to it, the way he's just, giving kind of backhanded slaps to the whole tradition of Marxism. Indeed, he's making orthodox Marxists look like a laughingstock, look like fools. Now, he does not do that for no reason. One of the recurring elements here, both in the appreciation of Cedric Robinson's Black Marxism and in the left-wing denunciation of Black Lives Matter as a movement today, one of the factors is the Marxist commitment to class struggle and class analysis only, which leads them to, and really this is just insane, it leads them to dismiss any discussion of race, racism, and even nationality and nationalism. It leads them to dismiss all of that as so-called false consciousness. Some of you may have heard and even joked about this phrase, no struggle but the class struggle. Well, orthodox Marxists take that tremendously seriously, and it leads them to insist that race really isn't important at all. obviously, in the history of the United States of America, race is important. And what Cedric Robinson shows in chapter 1 of this is no, slavery wasn't new. Racism wasn't new. Let's really talk, using a lot of the language of world systems theory, let's really talk about how the system of European colonialism developed and European industrialization developed, going all the way back to ancient Greece and Rome. Let's really point to the profound continuities, and he does make really useful comparisons between racism against Jews, i.e. anti-Semitism, and racism against blacks. He talks about the way in which racism against the Irish in England was coeval with the emergence of the plantation economy, the creation of plantations, really the colonization or recolonization of Ireland by the English going on concurrently with the colonization of places like Virginia. I mean, you can already tell just from these little snippets of the book I'm alluding to here. This is a very dense, very factual, profound reevaluation of history that is coming to the conclusion that probably everyone in this audience shares. Yes, race matters. Yes, racism matters. Yes, this was a crucial component of what happened in the history of Europe, in the history of North America, the Caribbean, South America. And this is, however, not the only thing that is profoundly wrong with Marxism. So what this book moves on to do in the later chapters, that I admittedly haven't read yet, is he goes on also to examine some of the black revolutionary leaders, or I guess you could say would-be revolutionary leaders, intellectual leaders, people like Du Bois. So in proper French, his name is Dubois, but his preferred pronunciation was Du Bois, W.B. Du Bois. He became a card-carrying communist. He had a complex relationship with communism. That was an African-American black leader who became a communist. Naturally, the Black Communist Party and black communist movements tried to make a hero out of him. And what he's really showing is, in the first half of the book, he shows you that Marxism is completely the wrong theory for African Americans and Africans in Africa and South America and the Caribbean. He's interested in the diaspora, the black diaspora, as well as politics in Africa. It's like, well, Marxism is completely the wrong theory. It's asking the wrong questions and giving us the wrong answers. And then he moves on to the critique of particular black leaders like this, black leaders who are often just uncritically adulated in the 20th century and in the 21st century even more. He says, hey, look, here are all the ways that they were wrong. Here are all the ways that they were led into a terrible dead end because they blindly followed Marxism. So another one of his little erudite, twists of the pen that are, just as cutting as a twist of the knife is that he says, well, these abstract concepts that the Marxists are addicted to, they began as our servants, but soon enough they became our masters. Like some of the abstract reasoning that Marxists engaged in, it was kind of useful up to a point, but they let it get out of control. And at this point, Marxists are lying about history and misrepresenting history to make history fit their ideological and political narrative to suit their political purposes. And he's saying, look, that's not the real history of the world at all. Marxism has become like a cult of lying about history, and that doesn't tell us anything meaningfully about the past, present, or future of black radicalism, black revolutionary movements. So this leads him into discussing, I guess in the middle part of the book, it leads him into discussing something that's always been fascinating to me, actual historical black revolutions, rebellions, slave revolts, and independence movements that strangely seem to get overlooked. I mean, all the attention is on someone like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., but there's remarkably little interest in, for example, the revolution in Haiti, the various revolutions and slave revolts, and the existence of maroon communities. So slaves that broke away and basically had their own colony or their own community, partly just due to escaping from slave plantations, but also rebelling against and burning down slave plantations, then going to live separately in the mountains. Looking at that seriously and saying, okay, you want to talk about black radicalism, you want to talk about revolutions, let's get rid of all this Marxist bullshit. Let's learn from the real history. Let's look at what actually happened when the slaves rose up and killed their masters. So Black Marxism is a completely brilliant and genuinely inspiring book written by a guy, I've got to say, this is like the most impressive book I can remember reading from a modern American, period. It's very, very rare to encounter a book with this level of erudition, scholarship, and also just verve and tenacity. It's a fun read. Unfortunately, it requires an unbelievably high level of education on the part of the reader. Like, I felt like I was marshaling and drawing to the fore like my own decades of scholarship on a whole crazy variety of chapters of history and politics, right? I was like, oh yeah, right, Henri Pirenne, oh yeah, right, world systems theory, oh yeah, right, the history of the English Civil War and the French Civil War and Napoleon, and I've done my own reading about the history of slavery and all those things too. This is really asking you to kind of explore your own intellectual resources while you're reading it just to keep up. And if you were reading this as a kind of optimistic, would-be young black revolutionary or activist, I can imagine how profoundly alienated it would be just because of how demanding it is of the reader. But then above and beyond that, sooner or later, as readers are going through this, they're going to realize, despite the title, Black Marxism is itself an anti-Marxist book. We now return to Alicia Garza and her introduction to Revolution in the Air. Quote, "My first reading of Revolution in the Air left me profoundly confused. As a young organizer, I read this book as if each page should contain a ready-made solution to the challenges I was grappling with. How could we build a million-strong movement when our organization and those we work closely with only engaged hundreds? Could anything be done to close the gap between paid staff organizers and the membership of organizations who were largely working-class people of color?" Of course, this approach was misguided, but certainly fit the stage of development that I was in. I hadn't yet spent enough time building the movement to understand its nuances. I hadn't yet studied much of the origins of Marxist-Leninist tradition that I was loosely trained in. I made it all the way through the first part and then skimmed the rest. I'll come back to it, I said to myself. We can and must make a commitment to learning new lessons, and, more specifically, making new mistakes. I'm still struck by how many of the endeavors described in this book are things that I and my peers have done or experienced. So to be clear, she's saying that it's remarkable for her that in reading about the errors of black communism, African-American Marxism in the 1960s and 1970s, she's struck by how many of these mistakes are the same mistakes she and her peers made more recently than the year 2000. This would have been in the 2000s she's talking about. Make no mistake, there will never be a successful internationalist left in the United States if we cannot learn from mistakes that have been plaguing us for decades, staying grounded in the actual material conditions while reaching for the sky. Though a measure of revolutionary romanticism was involved for some, most of those who, quote, turned to Lenin, Mao, and Che probed and studied before making this life-changing decision. They concluded that Third World Marxism embodied the most penetrating insights into the working of U.S. society, that U.S.-style racism, capitalism, and empire building were structurally and historically intertwined, that, quote, the wretched of the earth, close quote, people of color at home and abroad, would have to be at the center if the world was to be transformed. The new communist movement was their attempt, decisively shaped by dominant perspectives in the international left at the time, to turn these insights into a practical political force, to join together as comrades across barriers of race, nationality, gender, and age, to sink roots among workers and the oppressed. Now, I have just added the comment, and it utterly failed. Even if we only compare it to the Nation of Islam, it was a failure. There were actually many highly eccentric African-American political movements in this same period, 60s, 70s, and 80s, like including even like the Black Hebrew Israelites, various black nationalist, black separatist movements, but obviously the Nation of Islam, that, in case you didn't know, had Malcolm X as its main leader and public figure for quite a few years there. He later broke away from it, of course. The Nation of Islam that also had a famous boxer you might have heard of, Cassius Clay, changed his name to be Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali promoted Nation of Islam. There were failures that were nevertheless vastly more successful than black communism or black Marxism. So I appreciate Alicia's honesty here in as much as she's capable of being honest about it. However, this fundamentally remains, the introduction to this book, and I would say the book as a whole, and one dangerous aspect of Black Lives Matter in the year 2020 remains, this kind of stubborn attempt to revalorize and romanticize the failures of Marxism, the failures of communism, instead of just coming out honestly and saying, look, guys, this failed. This was a total failure compared even to something as obvious as, the Poor People's Movement that was briefly led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Coming of age in the utopian climate of the 1960s, embracing a Marxism-Leninism billed as an all but omniscient science, these young militants thought they could fast-forward history through hard work and adherence to correct ideas. Throughout the whole introduction, she indicates that she is really sick and tired of the puritanical attitudes, the holier-than-thou attitudes of Marxists and communists. I guess she's lived around a lot of them long enough to know. And probably she's heard some of the same criticisms I mentioned at the start of this video. People claiming that she's not a Marxist at all, or not a real Marxist, that she's secretly pro-capitalist, or that any discourse about race and racism is just quote-unquote false consciousness. The allegations that she's just a tool of the mainstream Democrat Party, all that stuff is being flung at her from the far left all the time. She is sick and tired of the puritanical attitudes she encounters in Marxism and communism. However, she is not quite willing to let go of this label Marxist yet. She's not willing to just recognize historically communism was a failure on a massive scale in Russia, in China, in Laos, in Vietnam, in Cuba, etc. She's not willing to recognize that, but she's also not willing to recognize that it's been a failure on the tiny scale of the horrible effect it had in the lives of the people who believed in it most in the United States of America. Flexibility, openness, generosity of spirit, and a democratic culture of respect for every individual are indispensable. Footnote, also all of those things are not Marxist. Again, she's not quite willing to come out of the closet and say she's against Marxism. Maybe 10 years from now, maybe 5 years from now, she'll really reevaluate this and make a clearer statement about where her own, feelings lie. But flexibility, openness, generosity of spirit, and a democratic culture, the rights of the individual, none of that is in the Marxist canon. None of those are the attitudes cultivated by members of the so-called communist vanguard. Quite the contrary. Quote, one of the most counterproductive and painful features of the new communist movement was its tendency to mistake toughness for commitment, rigidity for steadfastness, attacks on other leftists for adherence to principle, to construct a welcoming and sustaining political culture. Rooted in the American experience, it would be wise to look beyond the Marxist pantheon and learn all we can from the towering intellectual, moral, and political contributions of Dr. Martin Luther King. Now, with that statement, of course, I agree. But this leaves us with the open question of how Marxist or how anti-Marxist is Black Lives Matter? I think the most honest answer you can give is twofold, related to the two different leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement, the two different founders who are now most vocally stepping up to represent that movement, giving interviews to TV news stations and on their Twitter and social media, so on and so forth. I think we can say that Alicia Garza remains profoundly ambivalent about the history of Marxism and is very unsure of what Marxism will mean for the future of black radical activism. However, she's not quite willing to part ways with it. She's not quite willing to face up to the failures of the past. And it seems to me that her main sort of creative response to what she dislikes about, or even what she despises about, communists and Marxists, whom she's known and collaborated with for many, many years, is to embrace this very informal, very folksy, very chatty, very personable style of politics. I mean, the podcast I just heard from her, she describes how she drinks hard liquor at the end of a hard day. She makes jokes about going to the hairdresser and hair and nails and beauty products. She's really making this kind of conscious effort to overthrow the militancy that, isn't just associated with Marxist revolutionaries, but, it's associated with the whole of the hard left. She's really trying to say that, no, that's not the way she's going to do politics. And obviously, I have a very informal style here on YouTube. I can't remember the last time I had a scripted video or even made a list of bullet points on paper. Nothing was written down for this YouTube video. It's all off the top of my head. I also embrace informal politics to some extent. However, I think the more you examine what's going on today in 2020 with Black Lives Matter, the more you might appreciate the significance of having party discipline, of having a party manifesto, of having things that define exactly what the movement is and what it isn't, and not just to rely on people having an appealing personality and chit-chatting, on YouTube, in their podcasts, and relying on goodwill and cooperation arising out of messages back and forth over Twitter. It does indeed start to seem a little bit bourgeois, decadent, and self-indulgent. Speaking of which, let's for the first time in this video take a brief look at what Patrisse Cullors, the other co-founder of Black Lives Matter, has been doing with her newfound fame. Yes, that's right. Artist, organizer, and freedom fighter. Never forget that the word artist is there first and foremost. And I drew attention before to how peculiar it is that her university degree, earned just a few years ago at UCLA, how peculiar it was that she chose to study religion in university rather than something related to her political activism. But we can also say it's a little bit strange that she didn't study something more directly related to her so-called art. What is her art? No, it's not painting. No, it's not drawing. No, she can't play the trombone. She puts on performances like this, in which she is completely naked, aside from gold paint all over her body, and stands around in a field. A recurring element of her performance art seems to be her lying down in a bathtub, and I think if you just examine the expressions on the faces of the people in the crowd here, you can imagine how awkward you might feel if you had to attend this particular type of performance art from the co-founder of Black Lives Matter. Here's her artist statement on one of these performances. Quote, "As a black queer woman living inside a world that is constantly trying to kill me, respite, reprieve, and healing, an evening of cleansing is my latest work for my 2019 thesis solo show." Yes, so the idea is that the cleansing here is both metaphorical and literal, as she is lying in a bathtub. So, in looking at the highly diffuse and decentralized phenomenon of Black Lives Matter, people who are looking for some kind of philosophical or intellectual basis for what it was, what it is, and what it will be, they will be left with much of the same strange ambivalence and confusion that Alicia Garza expresses in the introduction of that book. There will be some people on the left who are now looking towards BLM, hopefully, as if this is going to bring about the revival of Marxism in the United States of America, perhaps specifically a revival of Black Marxism, as the title of the book says. But could this instead be a moment to look back on this history, the same history that Max Elbaum writes about in Revolution in the Air and that Robinson writes about in Black Marxism? Could this be an opportunity to look back at those mistakes and just frankly admit, yeah, those were mistakes. This was the wrong road that black radicals went down in the 1960s and 1970s. And we can't even imagine how much better off African Americans in the United States might be today if they hadn't gone down this road, if they'd taken any other path to progress, if they'd taken any other path to pursuit of, say, reforming the democracy you're a part of and really improving it, rather than engaging in, frankly, accelerationist fantasies of a violent revolution that would, drag the United States down further to be something more like Vietnam or Cambodia. When I first criticized Black Lives Matter years ago, I pointed out the weaknesses in their constitution, and that constitution has now been deleted from the internet. They're a movement that has chosen to refuse to define itself as a movement. They first emerged as merely a hashtag, as a catchphrase, and the question is, can they become something more, better, bigger? Can they change the history of the world, or are they just going to be a fad loosely inspired by a hashtag and a catchphrase. I think that is a tremendous challenge for the founders and the leaders of Black Lives Matter movement. And I think it leaves people, including people in this audience right now, Googling around wondering, what can I read or what rock do I have to look under to figure out the intellectual and philosophical basis of what this thing is and what its potential in the future can be. The answer to the question, is Black Lives Matter a Marxist movement, is maybe. Because they've utterly refused to define themselves in this way. They've utterly refused to provide us with a constitution or a manifesto or a clear sense of direction, purpose, the goals they're trying to achieve, what they are and are not willing to do to get there. I think the question could instead be asked as follows. Are Marxists powerful enough to co-opt and take over Black Lives Matter as a movement? And in the year 2020, my bet is nah.